Argentina and
Okay.
Brazil, but for fun.
Welcome everyone to one of my favorite evenings. I say this before, but I'm so happy to have these two authors here tonight to talk about political literature and their new books that were just published now in September. So please welcome with me Jonathan Coe and Giuliano da Empoli. Welcome to Vienna. Also very nice that we have the publishers here for Jonathan Coe's German publisher Folio. Unfortunately, Giuliano's, of course, are flying around somewhere else, the Becks in Germany. But it's very nice that we find ourselves here to discuss a few different questions. I think it's very good if I first introduce our authors a little bit, since they come from two different countries and have very different biographies. Jonathan Coe, of course, is an old hand in Kreisky Forum because he has been here before, since we introduced to you here in Vienna the novel that maybe is the most contemporary political of all of his novels of the current period, Middle England, which was very important for all of us in Austria or in Europe because it described to us how it can happen in a literary form, how Britain decided to leave. And it all starts in Middle England, where Jonathan wrote with his very typical, satirical, witty ways, with a lot of empathy and understanding also how, especially in Middle England, this middle class decided that Europe was something they could lose. But he, of course, has been very important in British contemporary literature for some years now and has practiced the art of the political novel since he wrote What a Carve Up in 1994 and the Rotters Club. So he has followed from the Thatcher years till today what is happening in political literature. He actually would have loved to be a musician, but became too successful as a writer, so he had to do this as a hobby, which is, I think, something that a lot of people would envy you for. Giuliano da Empoli, on the other hand, comes not from the literary writing, but from being a political advisor, spin doctor, thinker. He started his political career in Florence as advisor and also as culture secretary, minister, so to speak, of Matteo Renzi, followed him to Rome when Renzi became prime minister, and has then moved into, founding a think tank and also becoming now a professor at Sciences Po in France. He's originally Swiss, is a Swiss, Italian, French, Austrian now a European writer. And I remember the day when a friend of mine from Paris called and said, Tessa, you have to read this novel. This is the most interesting thing on the market. And this was 3 years ago when
3 years.
It came out in France. In German is Der Magier im Kreml, the wizard in the Kremlin, Le Magicien du Kremlin in French. It was a sensation and sold 800,000 copies. Is this a new number, or have you reached 1 billion yet? It was translated in 36 languages. So a newcomer who didn't come as a literary writer really made a success of his first novel, and it's a novel about the legendary, slightly mysterious, and now defunct advisor, spin doctor of Vladimir Putin, Vladislav Surkov. When I was living in Moscow, he was still the figure that everyone wanted to meet so much, especially if you were a political correspondent, because he was the man who invented managed democracy. And now 30 years on, we are sitting here and we are thinking he invented not only something that he practiced in Russia, but they are starting to do this in the West too. So I think this was also why it resonated so much in the European countries. But this was the book that came out 3 years ago. Now, this month in German, why don't we have the books actually? Can we maybe, Jutta, could we get to the new books to show and put them up? Die Stunde der Raubtiere just came out in German. This is not a novel, but an essay in long form about how this type of authoritarian politics is taking hold in all of our countries, and also their cooperation with the tech brothers, billionaires that we see, especially in this White House under Donald Trump, with Elon Musk trying to reform American politics, which was a short-lived adventure, but there are many chapters still to come. Let me show you the books also. So both of these books came out now in September. Ja, das ist auch gut. Came out in September. So I wanted maybe to start with Giuliano, since the Magician in the Kremlin was just turned into a film and just had his opening premiere at the film festival in Venice with Jude Law playing Vladimir Putin. So we're talking sort of A-league here. How was it?
Well, it's a great movie, obviously, but no, the thing is, of course, Jude Law playing Putin sounds like a compliment to Putin, like kind of a big compliment to Putin. But really, if you watch the movie, that's not the case, because he made himself so ugly to play Putin that actually it's the opposite of a compliment, because, you know, Jude Law is kind of a good-looking actor. And so he's basically unrecognizable in the movie, and looks very quite repulsive in it. But the movie is. I mean, I don't have much to do with it. You know, I'm kind of I tend to have a fatalistic approach to things, in the sense that, I mean, there's a moment where you need to let go, and I think when you sell the rights of a book to be turned into a movie, you somehow let go, and the only point was to trust the people that were actually in charge of it. And I think I was lucky, because the movie director, Olivier Assayas, is a very good French director. They co-wrote the screenplay with a very good French author called Emmanuel Carrère, who also knows Russia very well and has written about it and wrote a novel called Limonov, and among other things. And the cast of actors is just spectacular. So, and the movie is very faithful and respectful of the book, which, I mean, I don't know if it's good in terms of making it a blockbuster. The actress at the press conference in Venice, actually, Alicia Vikander, she's also kind of a big star, but she said, well, you will maybe ask yourself what I'm doing what am I doing in a movie that's basically about men in offices discussing, you know, and talking, and yeah, there's quite a bit of that, but I think it's a good movie, and I think it comes out again. My book had a strange coincidence. It came out right when the full-on invasion of Ukraine started. Of course, it had been written before. And now the movie comes out at another turning point, and I think it shows this couple, this kind of emblematic couple of the political authoritarian leader and his spin doctor, a pre-modern figure, kind of an old leader, you know, with that I mean, could come out of a history book, basically, in its, and the postmodern theater of Surkov, of the internet, you know, parallel realities and stuff. And so this is a model that is now no longer just a Russian model. I think they kind of pioneered it in some ways. I think we see it spreading to different contexts. So I hope the movie is also, I mean, also tells a bit of that story.
We'll go and see it when it comes to the movie theaters. But this one that you publish now, this is an essay, and it starts at the UN General Assembly last year. Of course, we just have a General Assembly now, again, a year later. But you went, and the same subjects of then are very current now, with Palestinian recognition and the weakness of the international institutions like the UN itself, and how to deal with this entire situation that someone like Donald Trump has a speech there where nobody, you know, can even detect if this is a comedy or if there's any truth to anything he says. And people make fact checks for like 3 days after still, because it's so absurd what he said there. But you went there with Emmanuel Macron, if I understand this correctly. Did he take a bunch of intellectuals, as one does, so that they can study the greatness of Emmanuel Macron?
The French are, you know, they like to be surrounded by writers and people. But no, I guess I was really the only one going into the UN meetings and that stuff. I think maybe because I have this hybrid thing that you introduced, where, I mean, I'm not like Jonathan, you know, he's a professional novelist. I'm an amateur in a way. And I'm also a political advisor. And so I have this kind of ambiguous status. And yeah, I took advantage of that to write this book, because I think, you know, I was actually writing a novel, and it was still about, there was a tech guy in it, and there was politics and intrigue and stuff. But then, I mean, reality went so far that it was a bit frustrating. You know, also because reality can be disloyal to fiction, in the sense it has an unfair advantage, I think, which is the fact that fiction needs to make sense somehow. Yeah? It needs to make sense, it needs to be coherent, it can't be completely absurd. Otherwise you lose your reader. And reality doesn't have that problem. Reality can be as absurd as it wants, because, and you were talking about Trump's speech, so, you know, so I found it a bit frustrating to be writing my novel at that point, even if I now went back to it. And so I just started writing this that initially was more kind of almost personal essay, recollection, some memories, some things. And at the beginning it was an article, then it became a small book. And the idea was to treat the reality that we're living a bit with the tools of fiction. So, you know, it's a first-person narrative, it's the attention to detail, the atmosphere, trying to sketch those characters that I've crossed at some point or another. And so the result is this, the idea is to immerse the reader a bit into this wild new reality in some ways.
I mean, Jonathan, you were already mentioned now as the master of the fiction novel, the setting that you set out. In this case, in the Beweis meiner Unschuld, you also opened a little bit of a new chapter for yourself, going into basically a crime novel genre with a still very political context. But in terms of superseding reality, or which is faster in getting into the absurd, fiction or reality at the moment, how would you judge your own novel at this point, if we think of the content, which is basically a left-wing journalist trying to uncover the conspiracies that a far-right sectish kind of group of people are trying to do, who have, by the way, very clear, they resemble very clearly certain political figures in current British politics, like Nigel Farage or Liz Truss.
Well, I think Giuliano is being a little too modest by referring to me as a professional writer and himself as an amateur or as a professional novelist or an amateur novelist, because anyone who's read The Wizard of the Kremlin will know that it's an incredible piece of literature as well as a great kind of analysis of things that have played out in Russia over the last few decades. And it came within a hair's breadth of winning the Goncourt, I think, which shows you the kind of level that he's writing at. But it's true that I've been writing novels. This is my 15th novel. I've been writing novels for more than 30 years now. And the turning point for me in terms of political writing, I suppose, was a novel I wrote in the early 1990s, which has a title in English which can't be translated into any other language. The title in English is What a Carve-Up. And this was translated in Germany. Well, it was not translated. The title they gave it was Allein mit Shirley, Alone with Shirley, which may be one of the reasons that the book didn't take off in German-speaking countries.
A screwball comedy.
But yeah, that arose out of my dismay, I suppose, at what I'd been seeing happening in Britain during the 1980s, during the Thatcher years, and the impact it was having on people around me. Really, I mean, it was a collation of a lot of my friends' stories. In some ways, people working in the health service and in the food industry and these kind of places, and telling me about the kind of impact that Thatcherism was having. But that in itself was a crime novel. I mean, there is at least one murder in that book, probably 6 or 7 murders, actually. And I remember taking a very conscious decision at the time to write in this vein, because for a very banal reason, which was that it was a much longer book than anything I'd attempted before. It was 500 pages long. And I just didn't know whether I could hold the reader's attention for that long without providing some kind of hook, some kind of narrative curiosity. And I do think that one of the great, I mean, I'm a great non-finisher of books as a reader, but one of the few genres of books that I never not finish are crime novels, simply because I always want to know who did it. And it was interesting what Giuliano was saying about fiction, about reality outstripping fiction. And the word I would use is plausibility, really, that fiction is kind of hidebound by plausibility, and reality these days is political reality, doesn't seem to be at all, as we've seen in numerous instances. And again, my novel is a pastiche, in a way, of a publishing genre which has become very popular in the last few years, called cozy crime, where a murder takes place. Oops, I knew that was going to happen eventually. A murder takes place, but the circumstances are not too disturbing or not too horrible. It normally takes place in a nice setting. There are lots of funny, eccentric characters around on the edges of the story. So people read these novels for comfort and for reassurance, which, in my view, is a perfectly legitimate reason for reading books. But apart from the reassuring nature of the setting, there's also something very reassuring about the fact that you enter one of these books knowing that everything is going to be resolved, that the chaos which begins with the murder in chapter 1 will be turned into order at the end of the novel when the detective has solved the mystery. And yeah, it doesn't surprise me that people are turning to this kind of fiction at a time when the world seems to make less and less sense and seems to be making us more and more anxious.
But especially in this book now, I feel it makes so much sense that you don't only have the crime content, murder, who done it, solve it, sort of policewoman running around collecting all the data and all this kind of thing, but also it is so rich in this story of these student friends and enemies from 30 years ago in Cambridge, and how these lines, these narratives, the different ones, how their lives went, why they end up all together in this old English estate with whiskey and secret doors, which of course has to happen in a Coe novel if you are sort of set in this kind of surrounding. So it's very important, I think, for the reader not to have a simple detective story, but really what makes your books so rich, this atmosphere that gives you an idea how it's possible that something like in reality, it's called the National Conservative Conference of Nigel Farage and the far right in England, but also getting their incentives from the far right in America or in the European countries. And in your case, you call it true cons, the true conservatives that meet at this conference. And you get the understanding of who is sort of influencing them ideologically, where do they come from, where do they go? I mean, would you be able to write a detective story without doing what you usually do, explain England with it and why it's going wrong politically?
No, obviously not, because that was what I set out to do. I mean, it was meant to be a very simple and playful and short and light-hearted detective story. And politics kind of barged its way in. Quite early on, actually, when I was watching one of these conferences on television, the NatCon conference, it was called, and just thought it would be a good setting for a murder, really, partly because of my feelings about some of the people who were making the speeches. But, and I've also realized in the last few years, I suppose, that I'm in my 60s now, and I've been writing about politics and observing politics, British politics really, for 40 years or so, since Mrs. Thatcher came to power in the late 1970s. And obviously, as you get older, you get less adept, I think, at observing some aspects of the contemporary world, technology, how young people interact, how young people speak, and this kind of thing. So you have to play to your strengths, which I think for someone like me is that I have a sense now of the arc of British politics over the last 40 years, and particularly how conservatism in Britain has changed in that time. I come from a rather a conservative background. My father voted Tory all his life, and we would take the right-wing papers, the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail. That was the political air that I was breathing when I was growing up. And because I loved my father and respected him, I kind of grew up with this idea of the good conservative and the one nation conservative, as we would call it in Britain. And that has really gone out of the window in the last 10 years, I would say. Starting with Brexit. I mean, Brexit obviously is the thing that changed everything. But in strictly party political terms, you can pinpoint it to a particular moment, which was when Boris Johnson purged his cabinet of all the moderate conservatives because they were going to oppose his Brexit proposals and so on. And the right has really radicalized around the world, I think, certainly around the West. But I feel it very much in Britain. And I don't know if you were in London 12 days ago when the big demonstration took place. Of course. 150,000 people.
The Tommy Robinson demo with Elon Musk from the video screen.
Elon Musk live via satellite from America.
Talking about absurd.
And telling the assembled hundreds of thousands of people that they must overthrow the British government, in fact, or violence will come to them.
He said, fight or die. And we were sitting in our living rooms or standing on the street with the people thinking, oh, that is quite an interesting outlook for this society now. Didn't expect that.
Yeah, and there's no end to the levels on which that was kind of offensive and horrific to see. But one of the levels is just how uninformed it is, really. And, you know, it's become very noticeable recently that there's a huge trend in the American right for talking Britain down at the moment. MAGA want to fix broken Britain, apparently. This is what they say, and why they think it's broken, I have no idea. But I think in the same speech you were talking about at the UN, Trump literally told everybody that London is now governed by Sharia law because we have a Muslim mayor.
It was because of Sadiq Khan who wants to establish Sharia law as the law system. We had a case in Austria also, which I got a lot of calls after. Here was a private case settled by Sharia law in Vienna, which doesn't say that Austrian law has now been overtaken by Sharia law, but all the British journalists called me in London, said like, what's going on in your country? So I think the deeper fear and how quickly this whole propaganda also against the sort of complexity of democracy goes into the political debate nowadays is astonishing. Giuliano, so Thatcher triggered Coe in the 80s. What triggered you to write The Kremlin Magician? Was it your own experience as a spin doctor, or was it more the contemporary politics or the astonishing success of Putinism?
I'll answer that question in a second, but I would like to come back to the London meeting of 10 days ago because this is something that I kind of am deeply concerned with, and it's really the object also of my new book. Then we can go back to Putin, but I spent a few years now discussing Putin. I'm a bit fed up with it, but we can go back to that. No, because what I find important to understand is that Elon Musk facing the Tommy Robinson far-right crowd assembled in London and telling them what he said, like we have to dissolve parliament, we need revolutionary change now, violence is coming, so you need to fight back, otherwise anyway violence is coming. All that stuff is not a nutty tech billionaire who lost it and is now, plus fought with Trump, is now completely out of control. Of course he is, in a way, but I think there's something much more structural and important that we need to understand in this period, which is the fact that there's now for the first time a convergence, and Musk is a perfect example of this, between national populist extreme leaders and movements all over the world and the tech system and even the people who are in charge of tech, so the big tech oligarchs. Explicit or implicit, in the sense that Musk is very explicit, others are more diplomatic and discreet. But I think what we are witnessing now, which is really something important, is that we see that actually those nice kind of kids, mostly boys, with hoodies that showed up at the end of the 90s with tech companies and startups and then gradually social media, and who have now become extraordinarily rich and powerful, well, they have nothing to do, their values, their system, their vision of the world and the future has nothing to do with liberal democracy the way we consider it. They're much more naturally attracted to national populist leaders because really they have the same, they prosper in the same environment because those leaders could not have developed themselves and movements if, you know, if they couldn't count on the arena of the internet and you know, pushing all kind of extremist content and all of that. They're both outsiders. They hate traditional elites. Traditional moderate politicians, whether, you know, moderate right, moderate left, whatever, it doesn't matter. They hate, of course, media, legacy media, journalists, all kind of authority. They want to get rid of that. And especially they don't want to be submitted to any kind of rule or law or limitation. And so even if their outlook is very different, I mean, the very awkward moment in that Tommy Robinson Musk speech was at one point, towards the end, at one point he goes, yeah, and we'll have a wonderful future of robots, it will be like Star Trek and stuff. And you could feel, you know, the crowd there probably not so enthusiastic about the future of Star Trek and robots and stuff. So they don't really they don't have the same vision of the future, of course. But as Ivan Krastev, who's actually based here in Vienna, says, I think very wisely, in a revolution, you don't need to agree on what you want. You just need to agree on the fact that you want to wipe out what's there, you have a common enemy, and you think the time is now. And this is exactly what is going on. I mean, this is so. I think it's really something has shifted. You know, it's like we have a new power block that is trying to replace whatever was the system of liberal democracy, and to push for regime change, to push for something else, you know, to push for a different kind of political system.
But it's interesting that in Britain, Jonathan, as opposed to America, where this combination of the tech billionaires and Donald Trump in the White House and this very radicalized Republican Party, Britain is not there, actually. So it was the first glimpse now in this Tommy Robinson demonstration where a lot of people who came there were not at all far extremist activists or thugs. They were sort of all middle-class people that were not particularly extremist, but I think the shift that you mentioned is happening in the society, that they don't accept anymore that this complexity of liberal democracy, which needs compromise between all the different interests in a state, the different parties and all this, that it doesn't function anymore. But can you see the difference with the US model, and what is in Britain in particular, sort of the British unique selling point of someone like Nigel Farage, who now is more popular in the votes, in the opinion, in the public opinion, than the Prime Minister?
Yeah, when I wrote The Proof of My Innocence, we were kind of in a little. It felt like we were in a kind of little moment of calm, and we had voted in very, very moderate, very, very centrish left-wing government with a big majority after 14 years of conservative government, and it felt as though you know, we were making a change of direction. That was certainly how I, in my temporary enthusiasm for that election result, saw it. But I think that was very naive, and that the Starmer regime, which I I certainly hope will survive more than 5 years, either under Starmer or under his Labour Party successor, you know, is really out of step in quite a fragile way with the way things are going. And most of us did not see the resurgence of Nigel Farage coming. We felt that having won his Brexit, which was always his big kind of one-issue selling point, he would, you know, withdraw from the political stage to a certain extent. But as you say, there remains a huge minority, but still a huge number of people who are very dissatisfied with the way things are, and tried to articulate that in London 10 days ago by attending this demonstration. And the interesting thing for me watching the Vox Pops with people afterwards was the number of people who could not really explain why they were there. I mean, they all had an anti-immigration agenda or a sense that we had too much immigration. But beyond that, it was just a vague desire for change and for kind of radical change and a very, very deep-rooted contempt for and cynicism with legacy politicians, of whom, you know, Nigel Farage more or less manages to distinguish himself by positioning himself as an outsider in the same way that Trump does. So whether this is going to lead to a Farage prime ministership in 2029, I don't know, but it certainly looks possible.
But we have a similar problem with the center being weak and not convincing to people in France, where you live, Giuliano, and where Macron is now pushing in one prime minister after the other in the sequence of a few months, possibly not surviving this fall again, and trying to get reforms of the economy through, which would be good for the French economy, actually, if some things would finally happen there. And it's almost impossible to convince a population that sees how non-dynamic the economy is in France to actually accept certain reforms to be implemented. So is it a problem of the political figures that we see, Keir Starmer or Emmanuel Macron, who cannot reach the hearts and minds of the population, or is it more that the enormous problems that we have nowadays in our democracies in Europe? Austria is in a similar position with an economy that is not functioning very well. Are the problems just too big? And so it makes it easier for populists to come in and say, like, let's just dismantle the whole system.
Well, you know, being Italian is not always an advantage, but it is when you look at populism, in the sense that, you know, Italy is kind of a Silicon Valley of populism, in the sense that it was really, you know, it's a place where we had 30 years of deep experimentation with different forms of it. And the common thread, I think, there were two things that have now come to France, which strike me, because as an Italian / Swiss / French and Austrian living in France, what strikes me is, after 20 years, to see those two things coming to France, and they're of course somehow connected. And one is the weight of debt and the public finance question. So basically, the whole political debate and even structure being defined by the fact that you have to cut expenses, that you have kind of a looming financial crisis over you, and this of course is a very kind of regressive environment, in the sense that, you know, it's an environment where politicians are always forced to, whether they're right or left or whatever, they really have kind of an external constraint that force them to, yeah, to be only, I mean, I'm not saying they're just offering tears and suffer, but, you know, they can only offer something that will be actually not very enticing to the public and to the electorate. And the second thing that is connected to this, that was in Italy, that is partially the case in France, two very different political systems, but the explosion of parties, the complete disappearance of organized parties. And this happened in Italy at the beginning of the 90s. It happened in France. Basically, Macron was a vector of this in France because he exploded the old Socialist Party that was already dying its own way. But, you know, he accelerated that process, and then he moved on and somehow also destructured the moderate right parties, didn't build one at the place. And so it stayed something very personal, you know, Macron's, and this is another feature of politics nowadays, in the sense that you have those figures, and they rise very fast, and they don't necessarily have, you know, Romans used to talk about cursus honorum, and the idea was that you needed to go through a certain number of steps to then be in charge of something big. And this is completely out-fashioned. It doesn't work like that anymore. Plus, people don't like that because they don't like professional politicians. Yeah, they dislike them. So to be experienced in politics has become something that's not positive. It's actually negative. It's a liability. All those values have become liabilities, you know, even speaking in a certain way where you seem to know what you're talking about. That's not good. You know? So all that kind of stuff. And so what you're left with is a system that's very volatile. And I think we see this in France now, where you have huge pressure, the pressure of debt, the pressure of external challenges. You don't really have structures. You don't really have parties and organizations. You have individuals. You have Macron, but he's on the way out. And so the scenario becomes very volatile. It's impossible to predict what will happen because things move very fast when you don't have parties also selecting candidates and leaders and stuff. Then things can move very fast. So there's a huge dissatisfaction in the French public, and I think that basically in these conditions the presidential election becomes a sort of a lottery. Who knows? You know, there will probably be a far-right candidate that will be on the run-up. The runoff, what it's called, the runoff, in the second turn of the second round of the presidential elections.
But would you think it's Marine Le Pen will
be allowed? Who's going to be in front of him or her? We don't know about Marine Le Pen. It might not be her. But is it going to be a politician? Is it going to be? There's an entrepreneur now that you see in France who has lots of supermarkets. Maybe he could be, but you know, it's a bit freaky in the sense that if the guy, he's probably a good entrepreneur and he's good at his supermarkets, but you take a guy and you put him in charge of France. And he's never maybe been in a public office ever before in his life.
As you say, that's his selling point.
Yeah, that's his selling point, exactly.
He can turn the Élysée into Carrefour. It might be sort of one of his projects. But are we looking at this now as a moment of crisis where literature has a role to play? Because that is always the question, does it have anything to do if you write a political novel with an urgency in the world of politics? Or is this a completely independent genre?
I don't know if I can speak for both of us, but it would be unlikely, I think, if either of us felt that by writing novels about politics, we could make a really significant intervention, practically, into how people see things or the way things pan out. I mean, I write about politics because it fascinates me and because it engages me, and also I'm interested in trying to show and trying to help people see and to understand how it impacts upon our daily lives, even if we think we can be kind of disengaged from it and remote from it. You know, it's all part of the human drama for me. I mean, I like it when people say to me that they read Middle England and it helped them to understand why Britain voted for Brexit, or they read What a Carve Up, or they read A Line with Shirley, but not many people say that. And say that it helped them to understand, you know, something about the Thatcher years, but that's not. That's a byproduct. That's not why I write them.
But so it's the analysis or the explainer more than it is an affirmative action to write political novels to make people understand that maybe they're running after headlines of populists instead of understanding how a society works, how political processes work.
Well, political fiction is no different from any other kind of fiction, really. I mean, it all, if it's good, you know, great novels will enlarge our understanding of the world. That's what they do, and they will help us to empathize and to see the world from different perspectives. And a lack of imagination is often one of the key failings in politicians, actually. Mrs. Thatcher in particular suffered from a terrible lack of imagination. So they can do that, and yes, of course, if they're also directly narrating to us, you know, events in Russia during the Putin years, as Giuliano's novel does, then there is an extra dimension and a more specific address to politics. But if I wanted to change the world, I wouldn't be writing novels. No.
Yeah, but how is it for you, Giuliano? Because you came from trying to change the world or developing with Matteo Renzi maybe new way of a political tone in Italy, and sometimes I thought about this, if you wrote about Surkov, because he was one of the most successful examples of a spin doctor, in terms, not successful in terms of developing democracy in Russia, but in staying in power, which is an intoxicating thing for most politicians.
So yeah, you mean since I failed so spectacularly, I wanted to like identify with, or at least live through the character in the book. I agree with what Jonathan said in the sense that my attempt to produce an impact on things and reality was through politics, and I don't consider that as a successful experience, even if it was a complex, fascinating experience, but ultimately failed. Otherwise, Italy wouldn't now have the government that it actually has. So, I mean, it's very easy to measure that failure. And of course, when I switched to writing, in particular, the novel, and I hope maybe to write more. The idea was no longer to change the world. I mean, the idea was that I had maybe understood something that I could express in a different way, and what interested me in Surkov wasn't so much the fact that he was successful, as much as I think this is something the novel allows you to do that you can't really do with nonfiction, which is to get into somebody else's head. to, you know, you can, because of course I researched a lot that novel, and I went there, I even discussed with people. I never met Surkov himself, but I tried to do my job seriously. But if you're still in nonfiction, I mean, at one point you have to stop. And what I wanted to do was to get into the character's head, and I think this is actually a useful political exercise, and I now realize this is something that I've been doing. Basically, it's my natural way of approaching the thing, which is, you know, if you have an adversary or an enemy or someone that's, I mean, that's not on your side, the typical political way of handling it will be to say, you know, a form of indignation. I mean, to be like, they're nuts, you know, this guy is nuts, or he's a fool, or he's just bad and nasty or evil. But that doesn't really work very well. And it's a bit frustrating, because then you get beaten up by people that you consider nuts and nasty and stupid, and so that's not very good for yourself either. And so I think what is much more interesting is trying to understand how it works, and try to get into their head, and try to understand the logics, and try to push it through imagination at that point, because you're no longer into facts, but you're just projecting things, and you're trying to push the logic to where it looks like it's going, and this, I think, is something that's something very precious today, because and it's something that fiction can do. It can bring you in heads that are very different from your own, in a system and in an ecosystem that does everything it can to prevent you from doing this. You know, we are less and less capable of seeing other point of views. We are less and less capable of identifying with others. We're more and more in our bubbles that, you know, just feed us what we already know and we already believe and we already... And in that, I think maybe fiction has an interesting role. Also, you know, in making very abstract phenomenons personal. I always have that Stalin quote in mind, where he says, you know, very famous, where he says, well, a death is a tragedy, but a million deaths is a statistics. Well, often politics is like that, in the sense that it's big phenomena that involve like millions of people and huge things, and so it becomes a statistic somehow. I mean, it loses. And what fiction can do is it can bring it back. It can bring it back to the individual, to the intimate level. This is, I think, what was so powerful about Jonathan's novel about Brexit. You know, that suddenly you have something that, especially if you're not British, you see from, you know, from kind of geopolitical whatever analysis, and then suddenly it's intimate. It's a family. It's a family dynamics, and this, I think, is powerful. I don't know if it's enough to change the world, and it might not be, but it is powerful.
It's also something, of course, that as a journalist, I envy you both for having the permission to invent whatever happens in the head of these people. And it's a strict no-no in my profession to invent what people have in their head.
Well, it's a difference, actually, between the way Giuliano and I go about things, because you put a lot of words into Putin's mouth in your novel, and I always hold back from doing that. I don't know why, but
certain respect.
Well, it's
truth.
often when I'm writing about people for whom I have no respect at all. So why not in a way? But I mean, there are a lot of citations and quotations from Liz Truss, for example, in this book. But they're all from interviews. They're all from they're all verbatim. They're all from speeches. And somehow I'm not quite ready to make that what to me is a kind of transgressive leap. But your novel shows me that it can be done, which is inspiring.
But there is, of course, a danger in this also, that you invent something that is so closely leaning on reality, but then you take it somewhere where people might believe that this is what Putin really said.
Well, you know, there is always, I think it is a thin line. And I agree, it can be considered problematic, but this is where something else, I think the most useful experience that helped me write my book was not simply the Russian research. It was the experience of being in the room where decisions and the relationship between an advisor and the leader plays out. And I think this is a very peculiar place to be because it's Machiavelli called it conoscere discosto, which means knowing things from a side. Basically, you're not outside the room like a journalist or like a writer or a professor. You're inside, but you're not the main actor. So you're a bit on the side. And this is a peculiar form of knowledge. And I wanted to reproduce this in the book because I think it's something that, so I sometimes use direct Putin quotes, sometimes not, but always very close to actual events. And I did try to, at times, reconstruct that simply the political logic that might lead you there. You know, what could be the reasoning and how, and I think it's an exercise, maybe it's a risk. In this book I've done it sticking to facts. It's the same principle, it's the same idea of being in the room and witnessing things and telling the story, so not from the point of view of a journalist that's outside, but from the inside point of view. But in this case, there's no fiction at all. You know, I think it's what historians do as well. I mean, it's what journalists do in many ways as well. Then it can take different forms, but I don't feel like it was a huge transgression, but maybe it was.
Well, we were thinking. Sorry.
I'm just fascinated by, in terms of your closeness to the centres of power, Macron's eagerness, it seems, to bring writers into his orbit, because I think he's used Leila Slimani as an advisor as well, and this closeness between the political establishment and the literary establishment. Is that a uniquely French thing? I mean, it's unimaginable it's unimaginable in Britain, but maybe that's.
I think it's, but even in Italy, it's not something that you have. I think you don't have it in Germany, and no, it's not unique to him. It's almost an obligation that French political leaders have. Even in his case, you know, he's a reader. He's sensitive to literature, theater, all that stuff, but even if you don't have that, there's something very unique in, which is also maybe the reason that why I write in French, even if it's not my first language. the closeness between politics and literature in France is unique.
And they love it
it's
also.
been like that for centuries. And so you have other places where you had moments, you know, you might have had, I mean, writers into Kennedy's orbit, or you might have had Churchill, of course, was kind of a literary figure himself,
yes,
and all of that. You might have, you had Disraeli before, that was actually a novel writer, and so. But those are more episodes. Yeah. You have episodes like that in other places as well. But what you don't have is this continuous thing where that's almost perverse in a way, where, I mean, almost every great writer would like to be a president, and almost every president would like to be a great writer. And so everyone's frustrated, but at the same time they kind of like, I think and another effect of this, which is maybe the most interesting from a literary point of view, is that you have an experience and a finesse in portraying politics and you know, not party politics, but really power plays and court mechanism and some stuff that's quite universal in a way to power. You have an expertise at that in French literature that is unique. I mean, you have people already in you know, the memoirs of the 17th century, and you already have incredible political memoirs of great writers who are close to court and talk about it, and then it keeps going, and each new generation does it.
Even Nicolas Sarkozy had Yasmina Reza sit in for 6 months to write about him in the end, and her observance of his
And the book is good.
way about how he goes about power. So I think...
Whereas the one time I was at a dinner with Liz Truss, the person sitting next to her was Kazuo Ishiguro, who had just that week won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And I pointed him out to her and said, no one from the government has congratulated him yet. Perhaps you should say something. She had no idea who I was talking about. She'd never heard of him.
Yeah, that's really a downfall. Okay, let's take a few questions from the hall, and while we wait for your hands going up and the microphone to go around, we were talking about our